Welcome again. Thank you for joining us for this series of Lunch and Learns or Lunch and Learn events. It has been 2 years since Catalyst Plus launched our Reconciliation Action Plan, Walking Together in a Good Way. Today is an opportunity to pause and reflect over those 2 years of implementation. This is not simply a progress report or a checklist of completed activities, although this is quite natural for us to measure results and have the check and the KPIs that we always needed to report to funders. But I think rather what we want to do is look into or think about this in a different way, thinking that there's a difference between having a reconciliation plan and becoming an organization that practices reconciliation in its everyday work. We recognize progress, but we will also look beneath the visible milestones. We will consider the relationships, assumptions, behaviors, and systems that ultimately determine whether a RAP becomes lived reconciliation. As we begin, I invite each of us to approach this conversation with openness and humility. Reconciliation asks us to remain learners, even when the work becomes uncomfortable and complex. So let us begin distinguishing the plan itself from the practice it is intended to support. A reconciliation action plan is important because it creates a structure. It identifies commitments, sets directions, establishes accountability, and provides a record of what the organization has said it will do. But a RAP is a mechanism, and reconciliation itself is a practice. The practice appears in how trust is built, how power is shared, how assumptions are challenged, and how people behave when making real decisions. It is found in policies and programs, but also in meetings, timelines, budgets, partnerships, and everyday interactions. This is why our review cannot stop at asking which activities have been completed. We also need to ask, are our relationships changing? Are we making decisions differently? Are our programs becoming more responsive to Indigenous priorities? Are we noticing and unlearning habits that reproduce inequality? So the RAP gives a framework. Our collective choices determine whether the commitments become part of our Catalyst Plus culture. So some of the most important evidence of that cultural change is difficult to see and is difficult to count. And then with this image, I'd like to suggest that we look beneath the waterline. Above the surface or the activities we can readily measure: completed tasks, workshops, reports, lunch or learns delivered. These indicators matter, obviously. They tell us whether we are acting on our commitments and they support accountability. But the deepest organizational change happens below the surface. It includes relational trust, cultural safety, changes in who has influence, institutional habits, and the biases we are learning to recognize and to unlearn. These deeper changes are harder to measure because they develop over time and are experienced through relationships. A completed workshop does not automatically mean that behavior has changed. We know that. A revised policy does not automatically mean that people experience the organization differently. So we need both forms of attention, the evidence of the activities and the honest reflection of culture and the relationships. Where is most of our energy going today? The visible tasks or the relationships and habits underneath them? And I think for the past year and a half is what is happening below the waterline. As we progress, as we assess our progress, I think we need to hold two truths at once. And this is something deep that I've been thinking and learning through this process of being the chair of the Reconciliation Action Plan Committee. The first is that internal effort matters. People across Catalyst Plus have invested time, care, leadership, and resources in moving the RAP forward. That effort should be recognized. Organizational change is difficult, and genuine movement deserves acknowledgement. But there's a second truth, and that's the historical context, where historical context matters. A change that feels significant inside our organization may represent a level of fairness, inclusion, or respect that Indigenous people should not have weight or had weight for. So those two things are whatever we do that seems significant at the organizational level, if we put into perspective and consider the 150 years of impact of colonization, this they may seem a drop in the ocean of that process. So those two truths are constantly, they exist together. These perspectives do not cancel one another. We do not need to diminish the work of staff or advisors in order to remain honest about the much larger history, nor should we recognition of historical injustice prevent us from noticing the meaningful progress that the organization is making. Humility allows us to say we have made progress, people have worked hard, and there is still much more to change. Holding those truths leads naturally to the question of responsibility. Who is responsible for what? Reconciliation is a shared responsibility, but the obligations are not identical. At the organizational level, Catalyst Plus is responsible for systems, policies, governance, and structural accountability. Individual cannot compensate for structures that continue to create barriers. Leadership has a distinct role, setting expectations, modeling the behavior we want to see, and making learning possible through allocation of resources, time, and things that are required for those changes to happen. What leaders consistently support and reward becomes part of the culture. Each individual, staff member, advisors also have responsibilities. These include reflecting on personal assumptions, continuing to learn, and making respectful choices in our daily work. Indigenous guidance is essential, particularly in governance and defining what respectful partnerships look like. But Indigenous colleagues, advisors, and partners should not be expected to carry the burden of educating everyone else or repairing the organization for us. So the responsibility to learn and change remains with the organization, its leadership, and each of us. This distinction becomes especially important when we consider how economic reconciliation is often described. This first model that I'm presenting now reflects a familiar way of thinking about economic reconciliation. We provide skills, capacity building, technical assistance, and tools. These inputs create economic opportunities through employment, enterprise development, procurement, and participation. Economic reconciliation is then expected to follow. There is real value in this pathway. Capacity and resources matter, economic inclusion matters. But the model is incomplete when it assumes that technical input will automatically transfer relationships or transform relationships. As we know, Call to Action 92 asks the corporate sector to use the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, as a reconciliation framework and apply it to policy and core operations. It calls for a meaningful consultation, respectful relationships, free, prior, and informed consent, equitable access, sustainable benefits, and ongoing education. The question is therefore not only what resources are we bringing, but we also must ask, How are decisions being made? Whose priorities define success? What kind of relationships are we creating? Once healing and relationship are included, the straight line, this model of a linear model, becomes more iterative. And I think this is the important distinction that we need to keep in mind when we go working with our Indigenous partners and thinking of our role in reconciliation. When we factor healing into economic reconciliation, the pathway is no longer a straight line from inputs to outcomes. It becomes relational, iterative, and non-linear. The idea here in this image is that a spiral is useful because it revisit trust, truth, learning, and action, ideally with deeper understanding each time we go to that cycle. Truth means understanding history, harm, and present realities. Truth grows through safety, transparency, choice, and reliability. Shared direction means defining priorities and success together. And I know that we do this well through the assignments and when we develop work plans, for instance. Reflection and repair require us to expand, to examine impact, acknowledge mistakes, and adapt. So renewed relationships then create a stronger conditions for this cycle to happen, for the next cycle. The idea here of healing sitting at the center is not that Catalyst Plus delivers or stage is just a check-off. Our responsibility is to understand how trauma and historical harm may shape economic relationships and to work in ways that promote safety, choice, trust, collaboration, and self-determination. That does not make us, Catalyst Plus, or staff or advisor therapists, but it means that we work in ways that support healing and avoid reproducing harm. I think a question that we can pose is how can the way we work support healing rather than reproducing harm? Excuse me. These principles apply in Canada internationally, but the specific mandates and contexts are not interchangeable. And that's another part of the organizational learning. When we think about reconciliation, which is a very Canadian context, or it has a specific context in Canada, this doesn't mean the same thing when we go into international context. So the idea of distinguishing those, the work that Catalyst Plus does in Canada internationally is important part of our organizational learning as well. Within Canada, our reconciliation commitments are shaped by the specific history and ongoing realities of colonialism, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, and our domestic, our internal RAP commitments. Internationally, UNDRIP remains an important framework, but respectful practices require attention to the rights, histories, governance systems, languages, and political contexts of the Indigenous peoples with whom we work. We should not expect to export a Canadian reconciliation model. So they are not the same, they're not applicable. The center of the slides there, what we want to create is a space where peer learning, collaboration, and reciprocal knowledge exchange happen. And I think that's part of the power of Catalyst Plus working in Canada and internationally. These figures that you're seeing help us to understand the reach of the Indigenous and Northern Services Department. So we looked into the last 5 years, the number of assignments that we have delivered only through the INS department. So INS has delivered 665 assignments, and 122 clients have returned to work with us again. So Catalyst Plus has also recently surpassed 2,100 volunteer advisors in our roster. So when we think about these numbers, they are significant numbers, but they are not on their own proof of reconciliation. Their importance lies in the opportunity that they represent. Every assignment creates an opportunity or point of contact between Catalyst Plus, an advisor, and a partner or community. In each moment, we have a choice about how we work. Our volunteer advisor model can advance reconciliation by supporting Indigenous economic self-determination, listening to community-defined priorities, adapting to local context, and sharing knowledge without imposing solutions. A returning client gives us another opportunity to listen, to learn, and deepen trust in those relationships. We should not treat the repeat business as a reconciliation metric. It is an opening for a strong and deepening of the relationships. And I think that's a moment that I pause to. Everyone knows this already, but the work that we do would not be possible without the advisors. So it's an opportunity to thank you for your work and for your generosity to support the work that we do. So that responsibility is best understood as creating the conditions for lived reconciliation. And I think this next slide, I'm trying to capture that idea. So the central idea here is not Catalyst Plus at the center, but and we don't deliver a finished product or see reconciliation as a finished product. What we can do is to create the practices, the practical spaces, the connections, the organizational conditions in which reconciliation can be lived through relationships. Relationships, therefore, sits at the center, not Catalyst Plus. Indigenous communities, advisors, businesses, and partners come together through our work. The number of connections matter, but the quality of those connections matter more. The example at the bottom makes this practical. So an advisor may arrive with a conventional method and fix the schedule. And if they listen, or when we listen and adjust our approach, and we honor that local community protocols, relationships, the delivery may be similar, but the relationship and the way that we work is different and has a meaningful, more impactful result. So that is, reconciliation in action requires respect, choice, flexibility, and community priorities expressed through everyday decisions. Our role as an organization is to make these practices possible, supported, and increasingly consistent, and not dependent only on the instincts of people involved in this process. So creating those conditions require us to work with urgency while thinking far beyond the current RAP cycle. And this is another, I think, truth that exists in parallel. So there's this urgency of acting today. So above the ground, you see the urgency of today, and we need to make deliberate choices now. Policies, programs, budgets, and everyday behaviors affect people in the present, so action cannot be postponed until we feel ready or prepared. But also below the ground, there's this generational perspective. The visible growth depends on much larger systems and systems of roots. In the same way, lasting reconciliation depends on relationships, knowledge, practices, and structures that may take years to mature and may not always be immediate available. Urgency without patience can produce rushed, performative, or short-lived actions. A generational perspective without urgency can become an executive or an excuse to delay. We need both perspectives, the decisive action today and the humility to recognize that this work extends beyond current leadership budgets and assignments and the RAP cycles. When I think about this context, or those two truths in a way, I think that we are planting seeds and growing trees that will not be benefiting from the shade. So after I'm gone, hopefully these trees are in place and other people are benefiting from it. I think this helps to put into perspective the need to act right now, today, recognizing that the amount of work that is ahead um, is huge, but at the same time, knowing that the future, or hoping that the future will be better. And I think this, in a way, connects with every one of us here. We're investing in a better future. Um, so this brings to the question I would like to everyone carry from this conversation today, and that's my last slide, is imagine that the RAP document disappeared now. What should remain permanently changed in Catalyst Plus, and in how each of us approaches our work. So what is the real transformation? Perhaps it would be who participates in decisions and whose knowledge is respected. Perhaps it would be how we we establish timelines, define success, allocate resource, or respond when harm occurs. So the RAP is necessary because it creates the direction, helps us to be accountable, and creates a momentum. But the ultimate measure of the organizational transformation is whether the practice survives beyond the document. I invite us to take a moment and identify one change we believe should become permanent. Then consider on um, your own role. What can you reinforce, model, or do differently so that change becomes part of how Catalyst Plus operate? So the message is here is the mechanism is temporary, but the practice must become permanent. So again, we intentionally avoided going to the specific metrics, and I think reflecting on what we are learning and some of the learning that is happening that is not so much visible, I think is part what I wanted to share today. Happy to open up for conversation. And again, thanks for listening. I'll
Thanks,
stop
Andre.
sharing.
If you have any, Pilar, let's stop